The city was alive with the usual chaos, blaring horns, hurried footsteps, and the occasional street vendor shouting about fresh fruits or roasted corn. Among the sea of people, a little girl sat near the pavement, her tiny hands stretched out, hoping for kindness. Her dress was worn thin, patches of fabric barely clinging together. Her face, smudged with dust, carried an innocence that even hardship couldn't erase. Every so often, a passerby would drop a coin into the old, rusted tin in front of her. Some ignored her entirely, as if she were invisible. Others shot her pitying glances, but walked away. Then he appeared, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, polished shoes reflecting the city lights, and a designer watch that probably cost more than a house. The man walked with the air of someone who owned the world. Richard Thornton, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city, was on his way to an important meeting. His mind focused on deals, profits, and status. He had never spared a thought for the people who lived on the streets. To him, they were lazy, unwilling to work, and a nuisance in an otherwise perfect city. The little girl, no older than 8, saw him coming. She had learned to read people, to sense who might help and who would simply ignore her. But something about this man felt different. Maybe it was the way he walked, with confidence that suggested power, or the way everyone seemed to clear a path for him. Gathering courage, she stood up, stepped forward, and in the softest voice, asked, "Sir, could you spare some change? I'm very hungry." Richard stopped. He turned his gaze down at her, eyes scanning the ragged dress, the bare feet, the trembling hands. Instead of sympathy, a look of annoyance crossed his face. He despised beggars. To him, they represented everything weak and pathetic in the world. His lips curled in disgust as he let out a short, cold laugh. "Do you think money falls from the sky?" he scoffed, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Instead of begging, why don't you go do something useful? Or are you just waiting for people to feed you like a stray dog?" A few pedestrians slowed down, watching the interaction. Some seemed uncomfortable, others too afraid to intervene. The little girl's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. She had been ignored before, but this humiliation was different. It burned. Richard smirked and tossed a few worthless coins at her feet, barely enough to buy a piece of stale bread. "Here," he said mockingly. "Buy yourself a lesson in self-respect." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away without a second glance, his expensive cologne lingering in the air. The girl stood frozen, staring at the coins. She didn't pick them up. She couldn't. Not after the way he had spoken to her, like she was nothing. Her small fists clenched, her heart pounding, not just with sadness, but with something new, a feeling she couldn't quite name yet. Days passed. The city moved on. Richard forgot about the little beggar girl the moment he left her standing there. He was too busy finalizing a massive business deal, one that would make him even richer than before. To him, life was about winning, about making sure he stayed on top. But life had other plans, because soon, something happened that Richard never saw coming. Something that would make him remember the little girl. And this time, the tables would turn. Richard Thornton was a man who never looked back. The encounter with the little beggar girl had been nothing more than a passing moment, insignificant in his world of luxury and power. He had built his empire on discipline and ruthless decisions, believing that weakness had no place in success. His days were filled with meetings, numbers, and conversations with people who spoke in profits and percentages. The world admired him, feared him even, but no one truly knew him, and he preferred it that way. Meanwhile, the little girl, Alina, sat in the same place for hours after he left. She didn't cry anymore. the hurt had settled deeper, beyond tears. For as long as she could remember, she had begged on these streets, surviving on scraps and whatever kindness strangers were willing to offer. But Richard's words had cut through her in a way she couldn't forget. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the way he had looked at her, as if she didn't even deserve to exist. That feeling stayed with her, haunting her in ways hunger never could. Alina had no home, no parents she could remember. She only had an old woman, Nani, who had taken her in when she was younger. Nanny wasn't related to her, but she was the only family Alina had ever known. The tiny room they shared in the slums had a leaky roof, but at least it was shelter. At night, Alina curled up on a thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, replaying Richard's words in her head. Do something useful, he had said. But how? The world was cruel to people like her. Every day was a battle, and yet, something inside her refused to accept that this was all life had to offer. As days turned into weeks, Richard's life took an unexpected turn. His once flawless business streak began to falter. It started with a simple miscalculation in one of his investments, something he barely paid attention to. Then, another deal fell through. Soon, whispers spread in the corporate world. Whispers that Richard Thornton, the man who never failed, was finally slipping. His competitors circled like vultures, waiting for him to make another mistake. His investors grew restless, questioning his decisions. Then, the worst blow came. The board of directors, the very people who had once admired him, voted against him in a crucial meeting. He had never expected betrayal from within. Richard's empire, built over years of relentless hard work, was crumbling before his eyes. And for the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar: helplessness. As his downfall continued, Richard found himself walking the same streets he had once driven past in his luxury car. The city, which had always seemed so small from the top of his high-rise office, now felt enormous. He had lost deals before, faced setbacks, but this was different. He had nothing left. Not even the people who had once praised him. One evening, exhausted and drained, he wandered aimlessly through the streets. It was the first time in years that he truly looked around. He noticed the faces he had never paid attention to, the street vendors, the laborers, the beggars he had always dismissed. The city hadn't changed, but something inside him had. Then, his gaze fell upon a familiar figure, Alina. But she was not begging. She stood near a small tea stall, wiping down a table, her movements quick and efficient. The stall owner, an elderly man, gave her a nod of approval before handing her a small plate of food. She accepted it with a grateful smile. Richard watched in disbelief. The last time he had seen her, she had been on the ground, holding out her hands for help. Now she stood with her head high, working, earning her way. A strange feeling stirred inside him: shame, regret, and something else: admiration. He hesitated before stepping forward. He, the man who had once humiliated her, was now the one who felt small. But before he could say a word, Alina turned and met his eyes. And in that moment, Richard knew his story was about to change forever. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the street faded, the world around them shrinking into this unexpected moment. Richard, once a man of absolute confidence, now felt uncertain, unprepared for the weight of the little girl's gaze. He had never thought of her again after that day, yet here she was, standing tall, working, surviving without anyone's pity. Alina didn't look away. She recognized him instantly. The man who had humiliated her, the man who had made her feel worthless, now stood before her. In a way she never imagined. Lost, weary, and somehow different. He looked nothing like the powerful figure she had seen before. His suit was gone, replaced by a simple, worn-out jacket. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, held something else now, something almost vulnerable. Richard finally found his voice. I didn't expect to see you here," he said, though he knew it was a meaningless thing to say. Alina didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him carefully. She had spent so much time hating him, replaying his words, using them as fuel to push herself forward. But seeing him like this, standing before her with none of the power he once had, made her feel something unexpected. Pity. No, it was something deeper. Understanding. She gestured to the small bench beside her. "You should sit," she said simply. Richard hesitated, but eventually sat down. The tea stall owner, who had been watching the exchange, walked over and placed a cup of tea in front of Richard. "It's on the house," the old man said, with a knowing smile before walking away. Richard stared at the cup, the warmth of it unfamiliar in his cold hands. He wasn't used to kindness, especially the kind given without expectation. He glanced at Alina, who had returned to her work, wiping down the counter, chatting with customers, smiling in a way that felt effortless. "You work here?" he asked after a while. Alina nodded. "After that day, I decided I didn't want to beg anymore. It wasn't easy. People don't trust kids like me. But Nani helped. She convinced this uncle to let me work. I clean, serve tea, and in return, I get food and a little money." She shrugged, but there was pride in her voice. "It's not much, but it's better than sitting on the street waiting for people to throw coins at me." Richard swallowed hard. He had spent his life chasing wealth, believing money was the only thing that mattered. Yet this little girl, who had nothing, had found something he had lost long ago: purpose. After a long pause, he said, "I was wrong about you." Alina looked at him, surprised. "I thought people like you were weak," he continued, his voice quieter now. "That begging meant laziness. But I was blind. You were never weak. You just needed a chance." He let out a bitter chuckle. "Turns out I was the weak one. The moment I lost everything, I didn't know how to stand back up." Alina thought about his words. She had spent so long resenting him, but now, looking at him, she saw something she never expected: regret, maybe even a little shame. She took a deep breath. "You can start again," she said simply. Richard met her eyes. There was no anger in them, no resentment, just quiet strength. And in that moment, he realized that wealth hadn't made him powerful. Power was the ability to rise after falling. And if a little girl who had been abandoned by the world could do it, so could he. A small smile played on Alina's lips as she picked up another cup of tea and handed it to him. "First lesson," she said. "Don't look down on people. You never know when life will turn the tables." Richard took the cup, feeling the warmth spread through his fingers. And for the first time in a long while, he smiled. Not because of money, not because of success, but because he had finally learned what truly mattered. And so, in the most unexpected of places, a new beginning was found. Not just for Alina, but for Richard as well.